Hi, welcome to our show tonight. Tonight's topic is the violence of organized forgetting. The topic is based on an article by Henry Giroux that was in Truth Out. We have with us tonight Sandy Baird, Marc Estrin, Charles Simpson, and my name is Pete Garritano. I'm going to read a brief introduction to the article and then we'll start a discussion about it.
You forgot the telephone.
Oh yeah, call in please if you have any questions or comments or criticisms of what we're talking about. The phone number is on the television right there, 862-3966. America has become amnesiac, a country in which forms of historical, political, and moral forgetting are not only willfully practiced but celebrated. The United States has degenerated into a social order that is awash in public stupidity and views critical thought as both a liability and a threat. Today in the news, the big story was, of course, Syria. And the headlines were that the specter of Iraq was causing Obama a problem with the weapons of mass destruction lie that got us into that war. So now we have Syria, we have the same situation, the chemical weapons, and that leads right into our topic. And Charles Simpson will lead us off here.
Well, I think specter is one term. I think we could say dead albatross is another. And the dead albatross is, of course, Bush hanging around Obama's neck. And what's involved here is the recollection, vague, perhaps imprecise, of what got us into the war against Iraq. And it's important to kind of look at some of the facts here to look for parallels and perhaps avoid some mistakes. So in 2001, the Security Council passed a resolution, 1441, which allowed weapons inspectors to enter and search for and destroy weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And this was to remove them from the hands of Saddam Hussein, who was considered to be irresponsible and in league with Al-Qaeda and to be likely to hand these things over to terrorists or use them irresponsibly himself. So there was a search for these weapons, and none were found. The search continued until 2005. No weapons of mass destruction was found. However, leading up to the war, in the 2-year period from 9/11 until the invasion in 2003, President Bush and Vice President Cheney and Secretary of State Colin Powell continued to assert that these weapons of mass destruction existed and that they included weaponized biological toxins as well as portable systems to manufacture chemical weapons and of course nuclear weapons. So this was a case that was made to the American public. It's interesting that Howard Dean at the time was chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and he claimed that Blair and Bush deliberately falsified the evidence to build a case for war. The Center for Public Integrity found that in the 2 years leading up to the war, the president and top administration officials made 935 false statements in a campaign to galvanize public opinion to support the war. So this is the problem that Obama finds himself in today, showing he's a non-Bush. Admittedly, we made a mistake. Admittedly, the CIA information perhaps was false. Perhaps the administration bent the evidence to achieve a preconceived goal of getting into Iraq, but Obama, of course, has to now make the case that this is not happening now as we begin to approach, as we get close to this potential strike at the Assad regime in Syria.
So part of the issue is that are we being reminded of these mistakes, or is our society being told that pretty much everything in the past is not like what is occurring in the future, and this is just one component? So that's where the organized forgetting, I think, comes in here. Are we not learning from history, or are we being told not to look back? Marc, what do you think?
Well, I think one thing that's been striking for me in the last few days is the amount of press that I've seen clips of, and that actually is looking back to the history of Iraq. And I think that one has to ask why it is now that the press seems capable of doing that, even to this extent that they're doing it now, without going into detail. And I'm not sure it's to exonerate or Obama or set him off in a different, but rather to exonerate themselves, because I think they have admitted how complicit they were, the press, in accepting and building up and rattling the war swords toward the Iraq War. And so I think there's right now we're in a moment of exculpation for the press. So.
I think that, that for one thing, I don't think the American people have forgotten about the mess that we got into in Iraq. The polls show that there's no support for a strike against Syria. That's true in England as well, where the resolution in Parliament today was to support a military strike against Syria, and it failed. And I don't think that the British people are going to be fooled again, and I don't think American people want to be fooled again. So I'm not sure that the Americans, at least, have forgotten the initial lies that got us into Iraq in the first place. Maybe Obama's being cautious about that. I don't see that Obama has any authority to do this. Maybe I don't mean legal authority, I mean any kind of authority from the American people, and maybe he's paying attention to that. That's not to give him too much credit, because I think he'll do it if he feels pushed into doing it. However, if he listens at all to the American people, they don't want to do it. Neither do the English, neither do any people want to do this? One
of the great statements of the Bush era was Dick Cheney was interviewed on some national television program, and he said, but Mr. Cheney, the polls show that 80% of the American people are against blah, blah, blah. And Cheney said, and I'll remember this forever, Cheney said, so?
Right, right.
What a great answer, right? I mean, in terms of being transparent.
Right, right. That's true. I think we have a question. We have students in our audience tonight, 2 students from Burlington College. Three students from Burlington College who are taking a human rights class at the college. And this student is Zach York. And what's your question?
So I was just reading on the AP wire that France, on the other hand, as opposed to England, France has said, the president, Francois Hollande, has said that the forces will be ready to attack, and he doesn't need parliamentary approval if it's for less than 4 months. So can we talk about that as well?
About the French?
Yep.
Sure. Well, first of all, the French have an interest in Syria that's a little bit different than the other superpowers. The French have always been in Syria. They were kind of awarded Syria as a mandate after the First World War. So they feel very closely allied with Syria, and that might be the reason that they are not hesitant to act alone. But I maintain the same position. I don't think the French people are interested in intervening anywhere.
Unlike the United States, neither France nor England requires legislative initiation or approval of military attack.
We can see how that's gone in the United States.
Exactly. I mean, and that's the irony, that even though Cameron in Britain wasn't required to seek these votes, he felt pressured by the public to seek 2 stages of votes. One was to whether or not military action would be approved, and the other was, shall we initiate military action, which was supposed to be the next vote to come after the UN weapons inspectors had made their report this weekend, and not before. Obama, on the other hand, who has a constitutional requirement to consult Congress and get permission from Congress and also from the Security Council, has made many public statements about how he doesn't need to do that.
Not only doesn't he need to do it, there have been many statements that he wants to do it prior to any consent from anyone else.
He wants to attack.
He wants to attack before there's even a report from any of the chemical weapons
But
inspectors.
this action on the part of England may very well hold him back somewhat. And then then we have to get into the question that we don't know now, of course, but what is the likelihood that the report of the weapons inspectors are going to support an invasion against Assad?
Right.
And if you just sitting from this moment of not knowing the facts, but if you simply apply logic to it, it would seem that it's pretty improbable, given the situation in Syria, that Assad would have initiated a chemical weapons attack right after he had invited the inspectors to come 10 miles from their hotel where they were staying, and at the time when Obama is making all these noises about red lines. The Syrian government has nothing to gain from a chemical attack. So why do it? Who has to gain is obviously the opponents of Assad, who have a lot to gain, which is to bring in forces to support them in a civil war that they are losing.
I recall reading a headline talking about how if we were to go in, we would be Al-Qaeda's air force. Do you think that has any merit?
There are elements in the rebel forces that, and many people believe this, and there's evidence to this effect, that the rebel forces include Al-Qaeda elements. I don't think that those are the entire rebel forces, but just as in Libya, the rebel forces who are seeking the overthrow of the government in both Libya and in Syria do include elements that are very hostile, supposedly, to the United States, and yet we find ourselves on their side.
At the moment, Obama is being very specific about not sending planes, not being an air force, simply lobbing missiles from the 5 battleships that are in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean right now. And the demand is clearly, don't get anybody killed, don't get any of us killed. Right?
Were you going to say something, Pete?
Sure. Well, the other issue that I have with this is, yes, we're looking back on Iraq, but in effect, we could look back on the history of U.S. invasion, U.S. Intervention in other countries, and this pattern has repeated itself over and over and over again for the last 50 years, and always failed to achieve the announced goal, which was democracy. Instead, always pretty much achieved chaos and disorder for years to come in whatever country we invaded or attacked, whether it's Libya, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan, and the list goes on. Iran,
yeah, very poignant right now with Iran.
So the press needn't stop at the weapons of mass destruction. Every single event, the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, every war was started with some kind of big lie that got the war started. People even questioned the Japanese at Pearl Harbor as to whether that was sort of allowed to happen, because there was no support for the United States to go into Europe at the time, maybe 15% until that happened. But the other cases since then, there was very strong evidence that almost every war invasion was falsified, along the way. So we're pretty much batting 100% as far as lying about why we invade countries. So there's not really any logical reason why we would ever believe the reason that we're being given to invade a foreign country.
I would add another one, because I'm just reading a book on the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 with John F. Kennedy was the president at the time, and the Bay of Pigs was, of course, invaded by the United States and Cuba. And that was the first one that I was kind of conscious of. And of course, that wasn't based so much on one lie, that the Cuban people would rise up to support the interventionist forces. And also the Maine in Havana Harbor, also in the Spanish-American War, which turned out to be not quite true either. So every international war, at least it seems to me, has been founded on a lie to get us all annoyed and ready for war.
Well, and the other thing about that, I just want to add a note about that one, is that people all remember, well, the Cubans were going to put missiles to aim at the United States, but that was because the United States was building missile bases in Turkey
Aimed at Soviet Union.
Soviet Union. And so this was the response, okay? That's why the Soviets were assisting there, but people don't remember that part of the history, that we actually initiated the violent, act there.
Charles was going to say something.
Well, yeah, whether we get into Syria or not, this is really a narrative about international law. And it kind of goes back, really, the rationale that Obama has cited is the Geneva Protocol that goes back to the 1920s, 1926, I believe, was ratified, which prohibited the first use of chemical weapons. And of course, this went back to the experience of World War I and the use by Germany of poison gas. And so that would seem to establish a norm that the Assad regime has violated. On the other hand, you've got the UN Charter, which says it's prohibited to use force except in the immediate self-defense of a country or authorized through the Security Council. So that's not going to happen because we know that China and Russia will veto any such resolution. So what they've done is they've changed the kind of the shifting definition of international law, and they've gone back to what happened in Kosovo in 1991. And what happened there? Pardon?
We have a call. We have a call.
Oh, go
Don't
ahead.
look under the table. It's all.
All right, we have a call. Hit the button.
We're working on the technology.
Hello, you're on the air.
Hi, I just wanted to get you guys' opinion on the Boston bombing and any reaction there might be between the U.S. and Russia.
To Cuba?
No, U.S. and Russia.
Right.
Sure.
Well,
We talked about that a couple of shows ago, but we could touch on it briefly, certainly.
well, the men who attacked the Boston Marathon were from a small part of Russia called Chechnya, and Chechnya is a place that wants to be independent from Russia, as I understand it, and has fought for centuries to be independent of Russia. And those Chechnyans that came here were probably people who wanted some kind of, had been sort of schooled in that kind of an idea of being independent from Russia. And once, I believe when they got here, they probably felt a similar kind of resentment maybe at the policies of the United States. And if they did it, if they are guilty of this crime, I would guess that it had those kinds of political motives. I think that, though, when we're talking about any kind of terrorism, that it's important to at least try to understand what were the reasons behind those kinds of actions, rather than simply viewing them as terrorists that are inhuman, which is not to say that anybody would justify their tactics, but I think it's a way to understand that the world is not terribly happy with our country, really.
The events in Boston are still not entirely clear, and they won't be clear until there's an investigation and a trial. And so we don't even know if these guys were responsible. There are a lot of curious things that have been caught on cameras, and I don't want to go through them all at the moment because this show is not about it's not about Boston. But I do want to make the distinction, which takes in what we're already talking about. Sometimes foreign policy is based on lies, just strict lies, and sometimes it's based on false flag operations. And that means creating an event, blaming it on somebody whom you then want to attack, right? And this, again, is a not exactly standard, but repeated part of American strategy in order to invade other countries, is to blame some event on that country. And it may be that the Boston stuff is a false flag operation. It's certainly, if we decide that it was Assad that ordered the chemical, if there in fact was a chemical, and there were problems about that, if whatever that chemical was, it doesn't seem to be sarin, because of the way it's being treated by the medical staffs. But whatever it is, and if it was, the assignment of blame is also part of the false flag strategy. So if we decide there was a chemical attack, the U.S. is going to very, very much want to blame it on Assad because it wants to go in, it wants to support the rebels against Assad, and it's again part of a false flag pattern of operations. And we can talk about that more, but obviously the granddaddy false flag, at least of our time and of all of these recent things, is the question of 9/11, which we can talk about.
We have a question now.
Yeah.
I was wondering for a quick comment on the Rolling Stone magazine cover that happened this past month or so. I know there was quite a bit of controversy. Several stores were actually refusing to sell it. However, I was wondering, even though people refused to sell it, it still had amazing sales. I was wondering if you all had comments on whether or not you think it was a genuine article, whether it was a glorification, whether it made an example of him. What did you think of this as a whole event?
I don't believe anybody criticized the article. What they were criticizing was the image, which made him look like an attractive young man.
Is it an issue of putting a face on someone we think is terrible, or is it an issue of seeing the human behind the mask, or what is?
I think I try to remind my students that terrorism is a word, but a terrorist is a human being still. And I think there's a real attempt in our society to dehumanize people who are accused of terrorism and make them into some kind of a monster. I think that the cover that I saw of Rolling Stone made this person look like a young man, quite sweet, and a human being. And I think there are objections to making anyone who is considered a terrorist into a human being. I think that really makes people very upset.
The image we like is Khalidi in his open pajama top with his hair and a 5-day beard and his hair going all of that. And look, that's what we want on Rolling Stone cover. And they didn't do it.
The problem I have with it, which is happening quite often now, is that all these people are suspects. They have not been accused of anything.
That's right.
And we're torturing people that are suspects. We're imprisoning people for 10 years that are suspects, some of which haven't even been charged with a crime. So now we're treating, and to me it was a disservice to do this, because he's no different than any suspect, except for there was a violent crime, people got hurt, but he's still a suspect. We haven't been shown any evidence, really, the public hasn't been shown any evidence of his guilt, except for that so far that they said he did it.
And we already know that there are big lies around this whole story, because while the FBI started to say, oh, we need your help, please try to help us find these people, we don't know anything about them, and then it turned out that they had been involved with them for 2 years, that the FBI had. So we know that the story isn't straight.
And then this leads to the whole issue of evidence, really.
Right.
And it's interesting that neither Cameron, Vice President, the Prime Minister of England, or Obama have felt the need to present evidence. What they've done is simply saying, trust us. I obviously wouldn't lead you into a war for no reason. Trust us. But there's no production of evidence. Now, what they have done is leaked to certain selected journalists some information about the evidence, not the evidence, but some information about the evidence, which apparently comes in the Syrian case, which apparently comes from intercepted communications among members of the Syrian army. And these were intercepted by Israeli intelligence, passed to the U.S. government, and then discussed with some journalists, but they couldn't see the evidence themselves, and the public hasn't seen the evidence, and Congress hasn't seen the evidence. So this is, another case where we're left to trust our leadership because
trust Israeli intelligence,
or Joe Biden or whatever, who claims to be utterly convinced that indeed there is rock solid, slam dunk evidence that indeed Assad was behind this particular horrendous case. And so in place of evidence, what they have is YouTube videos, which are horrible, of people suffering, which is not an argument as to who did it, or in fact, indeed, what kind of gas was used. This is simply an emotional appeal. So we have really an administration that's reaching out to the public for support based entirely on an emotional appeal and is unwilling to trust the public or trust Congress with the facts.
And Wall Street Journal pointed out that or at least quoted Ban Ki-moon, who was he's the head of the UN, right?
Attorney General.
Yeah, Secretary General of the UN, as saying that the assignment of the chemical weapons group was not to find out where these weapons came from, but rather only to determine whether there were chemical weapons and what the weapons might be, but not to assign blame. And if that's the case, whatever they come up with, Obama will still be in the same position of being able to say, well, there's no evidence, at least, that the rebels did it. Although Carla Da Ponte, who was the head of a UN commission for human rights abuses, to investigate human rights abuses, in May investigating a possible chemical attack, that committee, her committee, came to the conclusion that those chemicals belonged to, and the attack was done by the rebel forces.
Okay, I think that one thing that I think is really key when we're talking about the Boston bomber and all kinds of other situations is that according to the United States Constitution, people have a right to be presumed innocent until they're proven guilty by a court. That has not been the case in the United States for a decade, that people can be simply said that they are guilty and that they are locked up forever. Bradley Manning was not put on trial, and yet he was locked up without any clothes on for quite a long time because he was basically accused of whistleblowing or leaking information to the American public. That man had not been guilty of anything. You are still in this country not guilty until a court of law finds you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Or
and
the
that
president.
seems to, well, I'm not the president.
No.
Legally, under the Constitution, you have to have a trial and you have to be proven guilty.
But
beyond a
under the
reasonable doubt.
presidential
Yep.
orders, that's
Yep.
changed.
Yep.
Well, and that kind
But those orders, I would argue, are themselves unconstitutional.
Right.
Well, I mean, we forget that this is a country, unlike England, that has a constitution. And the American people, that's organized forgetting. I mean, the American people have forgotten that we are a free people, or we used to be, and that we have a constitution and the rule of law, and they've simply allowed ourselves to be deprived of our liberties.
And what Sandy was just talking about, I think, leads me to the fact that one of the things people would say Bradley Manning is guilty of and Edward Snowden is guilty of is actually getting people to think.
Right.
And so what happened was Bradley Manning reminded people how horrible war was and that horrible things happened during war, that people are riled up and they get up in their helicopter and they just machine gun people for no reason. And that's what happens in war. It's a horrible thing. There's nothing good about war. And the government does not want people thinking about that. That's why they don't show draped caskets anymore. They don't want people to know that war is horrible and people die and children get annihilated. And Edward Snowden came forward and he was telling people, look, the government's lying to you and they're spying on everybody. And then they said, no, we weren't. Well, he got the people thinking about that and how horrible it was that we're living in 1984 and that they know everything we do, and some guy that's got some secret clearance can basically spy on anybody he wants to and spy on any corporation, and so part of their crime is they're guilty of kind of forcing Americans to be critical thinkers, which the government doesn't want us to do.
Jared's got a question, I guess.
Yeah, well, I have sort of more of an observation I'd like to get you guys to comment on. So I obviously, like a lot of people watched, I don't know a lot of people, but a number of people watched Obama speak at the Lincoln Memorial yesterday, celebrating the 50th year of the March on Washington and Dr. Martin Luther King, and he talked about the idea of nonviolence. And, you know, in the same day, in the same news cycle, we're talking about launching missiles at Syria. And I just would be interested in hearing you guys comment on why you think more people aren't sort of picking up on that absolutely blatant hypocrisy. I mean, I don't think it can get any more blatant than that.
I think people are. I question that assumption that people are not picking up on the hypocrisy. Most polls show that Americans do not support these military interventions, and the English people don't, and the French people don't. I think they're a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for, and they do see the hypocrisy. I don't think there's an American that I know of that would equate Barack Obama with Martin Luther King. I can't imagine. Barack Obama has acted over the course of his presidency with absolute disregard for the Constitution. And I think many Americans at least know that.
Yeah, let me make a kind of related point, which is that it isn't as if what we're being asked to accept is it only a military strike against Baghdad, against Damascus. Damascus
One of
could,
the oldest cities of civilization.
could somehow effectively restore international justice. But we have an international criminal court. After the events in Yugoslavia, roughly 200 people were indicted by the International Criminal Court. 67 of them were convicted. There is a procedure to address war crimes, crimes against humanity. We don't need to use Tomahawk missiles to do this. There's another alternative if we want to support the institutions of international law. And apparently, the Obama administration does not.
Neither did the ones before it, did they? No, the United States has never granted jurisdiction to those international criminal courts and never signed up.
Well, they you know, because they were part of the main part of the coalition in NATO, which carried out, of course, the bombing. They've supported the subsequent, you know, special tribunals for those particular criminals.
Just a quick question about that sort of thing. Isn't letting the International Criminal Court take its course, go through all that sort of thing, that whole process takes place after, sometimes years after, this whole calamity would have happened. So shouldn't we do something to nip it in the bud? Shouldn't we, you know, put a couple missiles in there and stop the civil war, stop the slaughter?
But
100,000 plus people have died already.
But who gets hurt with these missiles? It's not Assad. He'll survive it. It's the civilians of Syria that are going to be blown up.
But aren't
Are
they
they
going
guilty
to
of
strike
something?
military targets like
No, they're not.
chemical factories, bomb making?
See, they
Factories?
can't disperse the gas, so they can't attack the gas supplies, and any kind of an attack like this is inevitably going to bring about collateral casualties, because you're talking about a citizen. You're talking about a urban area with densely populated buildings. But let me get to a related point. If the international principle of law that Obama is reaching for is called the R2P doctrine, which is the responsibility to protect, which came out of the Kosovo War, which said that, okay, let's say the Security Council is locked into a disagreement. It can't come up with a unanimous agreement among the permanent members, at least, to go ahead with something. Well, then, in this case, we went to NATO, and NATO said, well, of course, we'll carry out the bombing under this principle that collective response to human rights atrocities is entirely legal. But this principle has a couple of different codicils. One is that it's got to be proportional. Two is it's got to work. Three is that it's got to produce more good than harm. And there's no sense in which a symbolic strike on the Assad regime is going to be effective, is going to do more good than harm, or is proportional to this, this 1 million plus refugee situation, 100,000 dead. It's not going to affect those particular figures. So it's a rather thin rationale, I think, in international law for carrying out this kind of an attack.
What you said is so interesting, Charles, because those are the principles that were laid out centuries ago by, I think, St. Augustine, or about what makes a just war. Those are exactly the same principles that were adopted by kind of Western civilization a very long time ago, and yet they're always violated, you know? I mean, it doesn't seem to me that a strike, in fact, I heard these words that Obama wanted to, you know, show Assad a lesson. That's the reason that we're doing this? To show him a lesson somehow?
Teach him a lesson.
To teach him a lesson? It doesn't, what good is that? I mean, when it's really the Syrian people who are going to suffer.
And assuming it's Assad.
Right, of course, yeah.
I assume, Zach, you were playing devil's advocate when you talked about why don't we just lob a missile in there? But the fact is that that's a very common notion that, first of all, you can do these, quote, as surgical strikes. Second of all, you don't even shoot them at people, you lob them in, you know, with a curve in the wrist and all that. I mean, these things are very dangerous, and they have their consequences when you're on the wrong end of them. And, you know, if we know that Syria has nuclear chemical weapons, we don't know that Syria used them in the cases that are being considered right now. But certainly Assad has had plenty of time to move the storehouses around. We don't even know where we're shooting these, lobbing these missiles. You know, what are the potentials for getting it wrong, both in terms of, quote, collateral damage and in terms of not achieving any effective control of the chemical weapons?
And we certainly apparently don't have the desire for regime change yet, right?
Well, because that's what we said when we attacked.
I know.
Iraq. But one thing is also important, because Marc mentioned consequences. Syria has a mutual defense treaty with Iran. Iran considers an attack on Syria to be an attack on Iran. It's very likely that the response to an American attack on the Assad regime would be that Assad would attack American interests in the region, could attack Israel.
Right.
Iran could be brought into this, and then the United States would be left with a very interesting situation. They would now be bloodied. The United States would, I think we can probably speculate with confidence, would massively respond to that, absolutely massively. And we would just have opened up the whole Middle East to a regional war.
Which we already have done.
When you say Iran would be brought into it, there's a lot of analysis that this is actually a proxy war, right, and that the basic objectives of this war are Iran. And that's what we want to do. We want to get rid of, Israel wants to get rid of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria, and that the whole thing is to move over to Iran, to isolate Iran and teach Iran, not Assad, a lesson about what happens unless they do what we say.
Oh, Zach again, what?
There was, on NPR, there was a discussion about this, as of course there has been on most media outlets. And I believe it was the Russian ambassador was on speaking about the Russian position, specifically on the UN Security Council, saying how they do not want to move forward with a resolution citing that there isn't enough evidence. And I was wondering, why do we have to rush so much? I mean, it's the same thing as I was saying earlier, essentially. But I mean, is there some ulterior motive that we just don't know about yet?
The initial rush was about making the attack before the evidence from the weapons inspector came, because that might make it more difficult for Obama to make his case.
I wonder, I think it's an attempt to not see the evidence, if there is any evidence. It's an attempt to do this strike before there's a report that maybe it wasn't Assad.
Well, the administration claims that they didn't want, they thought the government would fake the evidence. If they had another 3 days, they would fake the evidence. But apparently, the weapons inspectors are entirely independent, entirely with integrity, and there's no real reason to think that they would be flummoxed and fooled by this. And Marc mentioned something before about whether or not they could come up with any evidence about who actually lobbed these chemical mortars and rockets. And I think they'll be able to see the remnants of the containers. They'll be able to see the evidence of trajectories. They'll be able to see, perhaps they'll be able to plot where these things came from. I think they could come up with a lot of evidence, even if they don't draw the line and saying, okay, our conclusion is Assad did this, the rebels did this. They'll put a lot of evidence on the table. And to not want to wait for this is just standing on the ground of irrationality.
Well, not only not wanting to wait, but to already, before the event, to say that whatever the evidence is, it can't be correct because we've waited too long and the evidence has decayed and there's been too much further violence in the area. So whatever they find is not relevant. That's Obama's current position.
Well, I'm going to read another section from this article because it kind of leads into something else. The United States has become addicted to violence, and this dependency is fueled increasingly by its willingness to wage war at home and abroad. So what this is pointing out is, what we know, we have a war economy, and so much our economy depends on lobbing missiles. We have people building missiles all the time. We have a developing police state, and more of this militaristic equipment is being brought into our neighborhoods. We already know about all the surveillance going on. So what happens to our economy? Maybe we need the lob missiles because otherwise our economy collapses. Maybe that's why we attacked Iraq.
The economy isn't in such hot shape anyway, even with all of that. But I would certainly argue that the defense budget, which has piles of money into defense, robs the American people of any kind of other kinds of expenditures which could actually help their lives rather than destroying their lives and the lives of people of the world. I'm not sure the entire economy rests on war, but I think that the expenditures on war certainly mean that there's no money to go around for other needs, that's for sure.
More than half of the discretionary budget at the
Right.
federal level goes to military.
Right.
If we include that portion of wars, debts, and the interest on those debts, and Veterans Affairs and things like that.
I guess when that happened, talk about organized forgetting. I mean, the whole military-industrial complex got built in a time of peace, which was after the Second World War. Before that point, there wasn't much of a military-industrial complex in the United States.
One last point I'd like to throw in here with this relevance, to World War II. Whatever happened to having a war and having sacrifice at home? I mean, I certainly haven't lived through it, but maybe some of you have. Whatever happened there, victory gardens and rationing. We haven't had a war tax in decades. How are we supposed to pay for these if even taxes don't go up? And especially now if we go into Syria, that'll increase our expenses. And
I think those are questions that Americans are really asking. I don't think they want their money to go into war. I really believe that most Americans are peaceful. And in fact, there is a kind of a nonviolent, non-interventionist history in the United States. It always has. And each president has overcome that to basically do what they want to do, which is to invade other countries and to spend all our money on war. I think we have forgotten that America once was a country that said we shouldn't intervene everywhere and that we should be mind our own business, stay home.
Wasn't it Jefferson who said no entangling alliances?
Jefferson, Washington said that, and in the last election, Ron Paul said it, and he got a lot of support.
Yeah, I would just turn your question just a little bit and say, well, who's paying for the cost of war? And it's very clearly the middle class. It's the middle class that's who can no longer afford to send their children to college based on their savings, who risk losing their homes because of foreclosures and a bank crisis, which led to a bank bailout but not a mortgagee bailout, and which has included a shift in the economy such that cities like Detroit have gone bankrupt that used to be the industrial powerhouse of the United States. Now we've offshored all that, and we have emphasized simply cybersecurity and military weapons procurement, and these are very limited job opportunities. And so
Spy systems, right?
spy systems, and we've recast what it means to be looking for a job, what it means to be potentially upwardly mobile, and it's now a scramble. Really, I think instead of the American dream being one of upward mobility, it's standing on somebody else's shoulders and kicking their feet so that they lose their grip on the ladder, and you perhaps get yourself up another rung.
Who's paying for the war is partially what you're saying, but it's also the fact that the Fed prints money to pay for the war.
Federal Reserve, you mean?
Federal Reserve prints money. The debt goes up. When the debt goes up, the interest payments go up. So there's a funneling of money off into the lenders, into the banks. And so it's not only that the middle class and the poor are getting screwed in terms of benefits and rescue and safety net, but that it increases at the same time the flow of money upward.
I mean, back when the Afghanistan war had a heavy, large number of troops over there, somebody did a accounting figure, I guess, that determined it cost $1 million a year to keep one soldier in Afghanistan. And I was having an argument with somebody about, the stupidity of this, and they said, well, what are we going to do if we bring all these soldiers home? They'll be unemployed. I said, they wouldn't necessarily have to be unemployed. We can give them a job at home that they get paid $50,000 a year and save $950,000 a year to actually do something worthwhile. And then if you go around the world, we spend $250 billion on all these kooky bases all around the world where people just kind of march around and fly planes around doing virtually nothing. And so all this could be put to good use in the United States and our economy, but is that, how do we turn that around and use that money instead of just wasting it? And it's also helping funnel the wealth up, and I think that's why it's happening.
I think there is a fear. Hi, Maziti. We have a question from Maziti.
Yeah, for me, I was confused of why, Americans were trying to attack Syria. And what I heard this evening is that it's just to kind of show Assad a lesson or something, teach Assad a lesson. So if the main idea is just that, then who is responsible of the innocent lives that are, to be lost in that place?
Who is responsible for that?
Yeah, the innocent lives.
If we attack? If we attack.
Yeah.
Why are we attacking? Do you mean also why are we attacking Syria as well?
Yeah, but I heard that the reason that we are attacking Syria is to show or to teach Assad a lesson. Then if that's the reason, then show Assad a lesson another way, not just to attack all Syria there and lose, lose the innocent lives that are living in there. We already know many people have lost their lives there already. So what if we intervene and just join there, just trying to find Assad and then losing all these lives? There are women dying there, there are children dying there, there are disabled people dying there. Then who is responsible of these lives? While we are just trying to catch
Right.
Assad or
I
something.
mean, that was the same question I think that Zach was asking. I don't see any point in teaching Assad a lesson. What is really happening, I think, is that Obama is equating somehow Assad with the Syrian people. The damage is going to be to the Syrian people. And I don't even understand in the least the rationale of teaching Assad a lesson. And I don't understand why Americans would even buy that. What are they talking about, teach him a lesson? By killing his people?
The alternative really is diplomacy. The alternative is
right.
Bringing all the parties, including all the parties who are supporting their various proxies in Syria, to the table and coming up with some sort of a resolution. What form that would take, I have no idea, but certainly the path of diplomacy is much more constructive to bring about an end to these civilian casualties, which are horrendous. But it's not just because you have a crime, just because you have victims, doesn't necessarily lead to saying that the response you favor is an effective one, is a just one. And I think when you think about it, what the U.S. is doing is dramatizing their their self-described posture as being the impartial arbiters of global justice. And that's just simply factually wrong.
By war, however, it's really kind of a
Once again, you can
total contradiction.
You can look at our history, and whenever we want regime change, and this I believe is the same story over and over again, we try in many ways to get it. And part of it is that we send the CIA in. I mean, the CIA recently finally admitted 60 years later that it overthrew Mossadegh in Iran. So now they have about 30 other regime changes. I guess they're going to, over the next 50 years, they're going to admit to overthrowing governments. And so we will we'll support the rebel forces, which we admit we're doing, or we'll send in, or we'll send in rebels or start trouble or do whatever we want. And then if that doesn't work, then we go to stage 2, which is bombing the heck out of them for whatever reason. And the pattern is repeated over and over again. It was pointed out in Naomi's book.
Naomi Klein?
Yeah.
Which is Shock Doctrine?
Shock Doctrine, where she goes through pretty much every invasion that we had, and they're all the same pattern over and over again. We wanted somebody out of there because they were either trying to bring about social change or share the wealth, and that didn't adhere to our economic paradigm that we want to spread throughout the world, which is to funnel wealth into the people that have it already.
But it's important to think about the rationale for that too. The United States always claims that it wants this or that regime, and notice the word regime, it's never an administration. Did you see that pointed out in an article today? It's always a regime which seems to paint that government in a very dark fashion. And the reason always is that that regime is dictatorship, and that regime is causing human rights violations to its people. That's the rationale. The fact is that I believe that it is some geopolitical strategy that they want to get rid of that regime. If you think about, for instance, in Latin America where they've tried to overthrow governments, it's always, again, that they are human rights violators. But if you think of those governments like Hugo Chavez, those were the governments that actually also had some kind of policy around social justice, always. And those are the ones that the U.S. is trying to overthrow. Anyway, so I think that one thing that American people would be wise is to question when they say that they want regime change for this or that human rights violations on the part of those regimes.
Well, I think we need to think about the evidence issue.
Right, exactly.
And get it, putting the evidence on the table. If the Obama administration the Obama regime will not produce that evidence, then what the president is saying to us is trust me. And I'm not a Bush. I don't want war. It's very reluctant, this idea that I'm very reluctantly engaging in Syria. But keep in mind that Obama, the reluctant warrior Obama, is the Obama who initiated cyber warfare. Never has existed before in the history of the world.
By that you mean an attack on...
Attacking the cyber infrastructure of Iran. And also who have introduced drone warfare. So we don't really have a reluctant warfare, a reluctant warrior that we should give the benefit of the doubt to in this case. I don't think that's a very credible assumption.
But what's to keep them from rigging the evidence? That's the problem I have with it.
That's
It's like having the pharmaceutical companies give you their report on the drug that they're developing and saying, here it is, this is our report. I mean, if we send in weapons inspectors and they're beholden to our administration, what chance does it have to be a fair? I mean, you can go back to all these other crimes, 9/11, any other big crime that was investigated, the Kennedy assassination. I mean, all these things were funneled in the direction that they wanted them to go. So it would be very easy to funnel this one in the same direction.
Yeah, but most Americans aren't used to calling even for evidence at this point. And I think that it's really important to remember that when you're going to go off and bomb people, that there should be real evidence. Or when you're going off and you're going to assassinate somebody, that is a murder without any kind of a trial, without any kind of a conviction, and without any evidence except what the president says is evidence. Americans, I think, should at least call for, that kind of real legal proof that something is going on that's worth going to war about.
And I think there's a difference between an international group,
Right,
entity,
right.
tribunal that looks at evidence or collects evidence and then looks at evidence and makes determinations, and a country which internally assesses who killed John F. Kennedy or who caused the events at 9/11, which are totally within the realm of a single state. And I'm optimistic enough to think that perhaps the international community could be more honest, could be
But
more objective.
that depends on how you frame the international community. Who is that? The UN Security Council? No.
Right,
You know,
exactly. That's
Well, it's tricky.
Yeah, it's really tricky.
I want to drag a point in about drone warfare. So part of this article is Americans are being more accepting of violence in this whole police state. So is the whole drone warfare thing where 50%, let's say, I don't know what the exact statistics were, 50% of Americans are okay with the drones killing people.
Well,
So that's a horrible thing to me. So does that make it easier for them to accept this because it's the same basic thing? Well, our government said these people were going to do us harm so we can kill them. It's the same premise really in the bombing of this regime. Our government says that he's doing harm to these people, so he's a suspect in a crime that has been committed. We don't really know, but since our government says, just like with the drones, they've got this intelligence they can't show us. It's this, they don't really need the evidence because they're telling us it's happening, and that's what they're trying to get away with, right? But does all these other things, do all these other events over the last 10 years make it easier and easier for Americans to accept things like Libya and things like Syria because of they're being desensitized to this, killing suspects?
The other side of organized forgetting is secrecy. And
right.
so that's an advanced forgetting
Right.
before the act.
Right. But the other thing about drones, of course, Americans, I'm not certain, of course, because I don't know all Americans, but I think that they accept drones because they think it's worse if you send in troops. It's worse for them if you send in their sons and daughters to do the dirty work, you know, and it's easier to accept drone warfare because it probably saves American lives.
Well, that's
which
cruise
is,
missiles too.
Right, which is a horrifying thought, but it might not be as sort of callous as you might think. I think Americans probably think, well, it saves the lives of our kids.
I think it's a racist idea.
But you
It
have
could
to,
be. It could. Yeah, right.
But you have to assume,
Our kids are more worthwhile than their kids.
Yeah.
even if your morality is drawn from Henry Kissinger, you have to ask the question: is drone warfare effective? And if it just generates Boston bombings,
Right.
what have you won with that? If it just creates, dedicated
Blowback.
Yeah, blowback, dedicated fanatics, then you haven't won anything.
Freedom fighters.
Freedom fighters, you haven't won anything.
Right.
Well, yes,
And-
you've won an increase in the surveillance state and the militarization of the country, which is very profitable.
Okay, then you've
That's where we're headed.
You've achieved a wider strategic goal,
Right.
which is to keep the war going endlessly.
But that's not the strategic goal of the American people. It's the goal of the administration or the regime, but it's not the goal of American people. I don't believe it.
I don't believe so either.
And I think that we have to always remember that American people are perfectly capable of coming to a reasonable solution to all these problems, and that I don't believe the American people or anybody really wants war.
Although
Except for the
Somebody
one-
does, but not normal people.
Well, except the ones that work in those industries.
Maybe. Do you really think that they really? Maybe. I don't know that.
Well, part of the
But-
problem with the NSA thing was they have how many people now at this place in Utah? Okay, well, they said I think that was the big rally with the White
Is that
House.
the big collecting?
Yeah, they would have had to shut the thing down if they changed the law. So all of a sudden, thousands of people have been out of work. So,
Well, the same with
They build a-
Vermont Yankee, isn't it?
well, there's a
Probably.
lot more people involved, and they just built a
Yeah.
giant building, and right. So,
But I think there is something to say that the American public is becoming insensitive to moral issues.
I do too.
If we can accept
I do too.
Guantanamo, if we can accept drone warfare, if we can accept the surveillance of
We can-
every single one of our private communications, I think that we have become a little bit calloused.
Right. I mean, And that's our job, I guess, is to
Right.
help with
To
critical
make more
thought.
critical thinking, right? And do
Right.
not forget history.
Mm-hmm.
And all this stuff has happened before over and over and over and over again. And what's that?
Time is up.
Time is up.
But there is also the bright spot that people still can use their reason, right?
Yeah.
I hope.